I Let me check it out, John.
Okay,
If you're
I'm just here, so cue
Yeah.
me when you're
Hi,
ready.
hi everybody. Today is Tuesday, November 18th, 2025, and our friend John Helmer is here with us. Welcome back, John.
Thank you for having me, Nima. Good to be back.
Yeah. It seems that we have some sort of problem here. I don't know what's that, but it seems that X, and I don't know what's going on with YouTube, but it seems that everything's fine right now and we are live.
Good.
John, let's start with what's going on in Ukraine. We know that there are two forces. It seems that they have some sort of differences in Ukraine. One of them wants to remove Zelensky from power, and it seems that the United States doesn't want Zelensky in Ukraine. On the other hand, Europeans don't agree with the United States. What's going on in Ukraine as we talk?
Well, as you understand, you introduced me as a Moscow correspondent, and so I view everything from a Moscow chair. Second, the what's underway in Kiev is very difficult for outsiders to understand, and is exaggerated by the Ukrainians themselves, who have suffered, continue to suffer from an exaggerated sense of self-importance. The Let's take apart the elements that you've mentioned. In the first place, there's the corruption investigations, which at this point appear to be stimulated by the US side. There's been long-standing USAID financing and George Soros organization support for the investigative unit NABU and the prosecuting unit SAPO in cutting certain kinds of corruption from the Zelensky regime and isolating Zelensky himself. At the moment, this is focused on Timur Mindich, but if you look very carefully at the Mindich allegations, Mindich himself and his associate Alexander Zuckerman were tipped off and escaped from Ukraine by road to Poland and then to Israel. They're in Israel. They may not be extradited from Israel back to Kiev to face charges. I can recommend for those who want to look more expertly into Mindich and his associates, and those Ukrainian officials, a former minister of energy, a minister of justice, a deputy prime minister. I can give you their names, but you'll find their names in a very interesting website called Events in Ukraine that's currently on Substack and published by a person whose writing name is Peter Korotayev. That's a Russian name, Korotaev. Which may or may not be his real name, and he may not be the only individual producing this. This is well-informed analysis of the Mindich allegations. It helps, and I have said it before, to be from Dnipropetrovsk, to be Jewish, and to understand how to steal very large sums of money. Those are the preconditions for understanding the Mindich allegations, and Korotayev has done a very good job of exposing them and also exposing their exaggerations. But let's get to the bigger point that you asked me. None of those alleged to have been corrupt, first point, and none of those sought to replace those who are corrupt want the war to end, first. Second, none of them show any readiness any more than Zelensky himself or Yermak, his principal advisor and assistant, to agree to any form of terms for ending the war. So this is a corruption scheme, a media scheme being boosted by the Anglo-American press, that's designed to strengthen the credibility of the non-negotiating, fighting on position in the Ukraine. It's not part and parcel of a scheme to replace Zelensky, Yermak and others in order to achieve a negotiated end to the war. It's not that at all. If anything, it's an attempt to change some of the chairs on the Titanic while denying that anything is risking the end of the war. There's no hint here of a British MI6 candidacy for General Zaluzhny, who's based in London. You have an MI6 individual on the show. He's MI6 individuals, like CIA individuals, never really leave the agency. And there's no one to say whether MI6 and the British government continue to support an alternative to Zelensky. But the key thing is none of this represents an end of war exit ramp.
John, how do you see the new agreements between Zelensky and his administration with France, and the way that Germany is talking about that the war between Russia and NATO is going to happen in the near future, in the next 3 years and to come, in 2029? What is that all about, in your opinion? I know, because to be honest, to be realistic, I don't see Europe being prepared or want to go to war with Russia. But when it comes to this sort of rhetoric, it seems to me that the main objective is the continuation of the conflict in Ukraine.
Yes.
What is your take on that?
Pardon me for looking down at my desk and my papers, because I like to provide strong evidence for each of the things we're saying, and for those listening to be able to disagree and then go to my website, Dances with Bears, to look at the references, to read more carefully, to find those who disagree with you or me, and to come to a better understanding for themselves on the audience's part. In my view, and we've said it before, the Europeans want to continue the war. They want to fight the war with Russia, but not lose the war. They must not engage directly on the ground on this battlefield, the Ukraine battlefield, or on the Polish one, or on the Baltic one, or on the Finland border, or in the Arctic. In other words, it's a program for continuing the war against Russia, but not engaging so directly as to risk losing militarily directly. That would cost very weak European governments, politically speaking. Politically speaking, you cannot get more unpopular and weak in France than Emmanuel Macron. Second, he is ruling by decree against a hostile parliament while resisting national elections, resisting calls for no confidence and for his resignation. The German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, is a weak minority coalition government, in which at the last election, Merz got less than 28% vote for his party, the CDU. These are weak coalitions, and this story is being repeated all over Europe, the Netherlands, Finland, and so on. What do these coalitions want? First, as I've just said, to continue war with Russia without a direct military loss. Second, to demonstrate, and this comes back to your question about the French agreement for defense cooperation with the Ukraine, generate significant domestic spending on the defense industries. The defense industry of Germany is a major beneficiary of Merz's multi-billion euro program to rearm Germany. And that's another point. Each of the major European powers, but principally the UK, France, and Germany, wish to dominate the military planning of Europe in the future in alliance with the Trump administration. So what you have is boom time for the European defense industries. That translates, whether it's Finland or Germany or France, into votes in key constituencies. It generates massive share price increases. We could hold them up, or our audience can go to the Financial Times or any monitor of share prices, and you will see that this war against Russia has been very good for shareholders of the European and US defense stocks, which have tripled. The index of these defense stocks in Europe and the United States have tripled in value since the war began in 2022. That the rate of increase generates the rate of share price gain, also turns into bonuses for executives of Rheinmetall and the others. That's Germany, but we could mention the French, the British, the Americans, and so on. It turns into bonuses, it turns into employment, it turns into union support, it turns into votes. This is the basis of apparent European support for the Ukraine. It's not a characterization of what some of our podcast colleagues call a coalition of the brain dead. This isn't brain death. This isn't stupidity. It is cynical, you could say, calculation of weak politicians seeking to monetize a war without actually losing. So if Zelensky signs an agreement for mineral and resource development with Trump, or he signs a concession agreement for long-term investment with Prime Minister Starmer of the UK, or he signs a defense agreement with the French, what does that really mean? Well, it means a promise for those countries to continue to pour taxpayer funds, much of which is now running out, and against which they must borrow, and against which they must steal the confiscated Russian assets, or use those Russian assets as collateral for pseudo loans, because there's no prospect that a war-losing regime like Zelensky's is ever going to be repay these loans. So essentially, you've got a massive financial system based on continuing the war without fighting it directly. That's the job of the proxies. And they're the Ukrainians, and they're dying on the battlefield and losing on the front and having to face the loss of electricity in the command centers from Kiev to Lvov, and having to choose between light and heat as winter comes on, without gas, without electricity. These are the techniques the Russian side is using to force Ukraine to capitulate, to come to terms. It won't.
Yeah. John, we had two different comments from the Trump administration. One of them was the Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Last week, he was talking about the sanctions, what was the outcome of the sanctions on Russia, and the other one is from Donald Trump himself talking about the sanctions on Russia. And here is what Marco Rubio said.
The sanction from our part, I mean, we hit their major oil companies, which is what everybody's been asking for. Obviously, those have to be implemented, and it'll take some time to begin to feel it. But, you know, I mean, I don't know what more there is to do. I mean, we're running out of, there are things that the Europeans can do on shadow fleets, and so a lot of these are happening in areas much closer to them.
Yeah. He's talking about that the sanctions are not working the way that the Europeans may hope for, or establishment in the United States may hope for. But here is what Donald Trump said, John, just 3 days ago.
I hear they're doing that, and that's okay with me. They're passing legislation, or the Republicans are putting in legislation that very tough. It's sanctioning, et cetera, on any country doing business with Russia. They may add Iran to that, as you know. I suggested it. So any country that does business with Russia will be very severely sanctioned. We may add Iran to the formula, yeah.
Yeah. What's going on? How is
Well,
that going to be perceived by the Russian government?
Well, the two things that are very important in the two clips you've selected, Nima, and thank you for selecting them. First of all, it's what Rubio said: we're running out of options. We're running out of measures. You heard him part say it and then partly lose the words. We're running out. We've come to the end of what we can do to sanction Russia, to compel it to come to terms and end its war. The war against Russia. That's the first thing. That's the crucial thing that Rubio said. The second thing that Trump said in the middle of the conversation is, since both of them are trying to talk tough, you look for what the qualifiers are. The qualifier in Trump's case was that he wants to accept the congressional toughness of further sanctions on Russian oil, and maybe add Iran too. But he's not at all confident that it will have the increased sanction will have any effect. Second, he retains the executive discretion to introduce sanctions, to enforce them, or not to enforce them. Now let's look at what he's also said after the meeting in South Korea with the president of China, Xi Jinping. He made it very clear in the same form of press format that he and the Chinese president did not discuss the massive sanctions against oil sales and oil deliveries from Rosneft and Lukoil to China. Second, he defended the Chinese need for Russian oil. So he made a specific and explicit exemption from the tough sound, from the congressional threat, from Rubio's tough talk of China on the issue of whether India will stop buying Russian oil. It's far from certain that they will. The US propaganda organs like Reuters and Bloomberg are in a muddle as to, because they rely in part on propaganda, in part on some oil traders, some of whom say there have been cuts by Indian refineries, there have been cuts by Chinese refineries of Russian oil, but that's short term. You look at the long term futures price, the 3 months out futures projection for the Brent oil market, for the Urals oil market, and what you see is adaptation to the new scheme of things, as well as the market recognizing that Trump's reached the end of the limits of these kinds of sanctions. So the Brent oil price is going down a bit. That means the market doesn't expect significant shortages of the supply of oil into the market 3 or 4 months out, beyond Christmas into January, and an increasing discount between the price of oil traded, if it's non-Russian oil, and Urals oil, the Russian oil. Increasingly, Russia will get less for its oil, but sell it and pay a higher discount for the intermediary systems that trade the oil, trade it through the so-called shadow tanker fleet, through pipeline deliveries, and so on. So there's no, and this is important too, those sanctions applying to Rosneft, for example, have been exempted in countries like Hungary, Slovakia, and the workarounds involving the delivery of Russian crude to Turkish refineries, Greek refineries, Indian refineries, which then re-export petroleum products to Europe the workaround is underway. So there is arguably a short-term disruption as the trade recalculates how to get around the sanctions. And the crucial invitation Trump and Rubio are both making in their qualifiers there is, try and work around this. We are not going to enforce. We're going to say we're tough, but we won't enforce. And we said explicitly, we won't enforce against China. We won't enforce against Hungary. Those are the specific exemptions. So it's talking tough, doing less. Implication, no significant impact on Russian revenues that have influenced the prosecution of the war. No impact. A nuisance, a cost, but not a decisive break. And it doesn't change strategy, not on either side.
John, what is India's position in the whole situation? How do you see India playing with the United States and with Russia? And where do they want to be in 2 years? Let's assume that, because it seems to me that the war in Ukraine is going to continue. I don't know what's your take on that, but we're going to see the continuation of the conflict in Ukraine. And many people would be interested to know what would be the position of India in the near future and in a long run.
It's a very important question, and thank you for opening the Indian file, so to speak, for our audience, because it's underappreciated, first of all, how important India is playing, not only as a member of BRICS, but bilaterally, individually, as a superpower state in waiting. India, China, and Russia are strongly allied in this conflict. The important understanding at the moment about India is India has been under attack from Pakistan in the last week. Why do I say that? The answer is that a terrorist group known as Jaish-e-Mohammed, based in Pakistan, has been assembling a large cache of explosives. 3,000 kilograms of high explosive were found by the Indian security services a weekend ago on the Saturday and Sunday, and the discovery of arms and explosives were followed by significant arrests of new individuals, white-collar individuals, doctors, in and around the Delhi area. This triggered a panic among the Jaish-e-Mohammed group, and one vehicle with a doctor on board blew up in the Red Fort area of Delhi last Monday and killed, at this point, it appears, about 15 people. The basis of the information I'm now giving you is my Indian sources and credible Indian press reports of what the police investigations already show. The explosion itself was accidental. A highly unstable explosive mixture in the car went off with lethal effect. The arrests of the Jaish or JEM network preceding this event shows now already that JEM was pursuing a plan of attack scheduled for December the 6th. That happens to be both a very important anniversary in Indian and Pakistani Hindu and Muslim community thinking. It's also the date this year when President Putin will arrive for a new state visit to India for meetings with Mr. Modi. So what we have now in the last week is a very urgent sense in India that it's under attack again from terrorist group, a proxy from the Pakistani government. And that in turn, because it's the Pakistani government directing this, leads to the relationship between Field Marshal Munir, the real leader of the Pakistan government, and President Trump. The Pakistanis, led by Munir, are emboldened by their relationship with Trump and are paying heavily for lobbying and associations and money contacts with the United States to not to stop or end the so-called terrorism link or terrorism organization or proxy war organization against India, but to accelerate it. What the cache of explosives mean and what the confessions and interrogations of the GEM members who've been arrested mean is that there was to have been a massive multiple bombing campaign around or on December 6 across India, triggered simultaneously with the intention of triggering massive intercommunal violence, bombs outside and in Hindu holy sites and religious institutions, bombs outside Muslim institutions to trigger massive intercommunal rioting and violence. Right? So when you have that level of warfare between Pakistan and India, it's a priority on the Indian side to once again evaluate how to fight its continuing war against Pakistan. That directly involves the United States. And Trump keeps referring to the fact that he thinks by threatening tariffs against India, and this is to come back to your question, Nima, by threatening India with massive tariffs, it persuaded India to come to a ceasefire in its April, May, June direct war with Pakistan. Now, I understand some members of our audience want to see Pakistan as the victim, Pakistan as the victor of that original war. This is completely false, and we don't have time to go through all the evidence. You want the evidence? Go to Dances with Bears, go to all sorts of sources and see what happened. What has happened is that Pakistan has become, through the relationship between Munir and Trump and others, and fostered by massive lobbying and money flows between Pakistan and Trump administration individuals, including even, according to the New York Times, the former bodyguard of President Trump. This establishes what is understood to be emboldening Pakistan, not to stop its proxy attacks on India, but to accelerate them. This must mean an Indian retaliation strategically at Pakistan. It must mean a form of persuasion of the Trump administration to stop encouraging Pakistan to do this, to deter the US from doing this. So this is a mouthful that goes to the heart of Indian security, but it also involves the so-called Trump threat to make peace by tariff threats. They don't work against India and can't work. A tariff threat from Trump against India facing a level of violence that was coming from JEM obviously doesn't work in any event. Yes, there's ongoing tariff negotiations between India, the Modi government, and the Trump administration. The Trump administration has shown Pakistan particular favor, lowering its original tariff imposition on Pakistan, whose trade with the United States is minuscule compared to India, from 29% to 19%. On the other hand, Trump has been escalating its tariff threats against India, especially to punish it for trading with Russia. Well, President Putin will be in Delhi on December the 6th, and will show the lie to that kind of threat. But we have to understand that first and foremost, India is under attack. And India is under attack from a combination that involves elements of the Trump administration. Now, if the Trump administration and Trump personally is reducing his tariffs to cope with his own domestic inflation, he announced it in some of these recent airplane press gaggles. He's reducing the tariff on imported bananas, imported tomatoes, because those commodities are not affecting internal US production of bananas and tomatoes. If he's concerned about domestic inflation because he must, massive unpopularity in the United States among US voters towards Trump comes from the inflation problem. If he's prepared to deal with his internal problem by cutting his tariffs, he's going to have to deal with his India problem by reducing or explicitly rejecting Pakistan's use of terror and proxy war against India. If he doesn't, India will fight back. If India fights back, nothing Trump does or says on the tariff front will make a significant difference. This is war fighting, not bananas and tomatoes.
John Peskov was asked about the meeting between Donald Trump and Putin. Here is his response. To me, it was somehow interesting and amazing because he said that any summit must be productive, and the productivity of the summit is the result of meticulous through preparation. And as soon as this preparation is completed and the conditions for holding the summit are created, we hope it will take place. Does it mean that the first summit wasn't productive because the American part were not that much prepared for the talks?
A very good question, Nima. And let our audience who want to come to podcasts to hear the news understand that we're not repeating something's been discussed since the Alaska summit. We're raising a very significant question. What exactly was agreed, if anything, at that summit meeting, which should have gone on for 4 hours, which lasted 2 hours and a quarter? Trump wanted to go home without eating his lunch in Alaska. What was agreed? Now, the Russian side has said repeatedly, understandings were reached in Alaska, and they are still confident that they can hold Trump to the understandings reached. However, the Russian side has not said exactly what those understandings were, first. Second, the US side has changed its position, first against ceasefire and in favor of a multi-element security arrangement to end the war against Russia in the Ukraine and elsewhere in Europe, to immediate ceasefire on the line, which is the position that Zelensky and the Europeans and some US officials advising Trump have advised. We've gone through all of that in the podcasts up to now. By asking this question now, you point out that we're still at the same position of changeability on the part of the Trump administration, Russian readiness to come to negotiating terms, but no readiness of either the United States or the Zelensky regime to agree in principle on any collection of terms which would make a summit meeting with a second summit meeting, a meeting potentially in Budapest or elsewhere between Trump and Putin, to make it worthwhile. So when the Russian side, when Dmitry Peskov speaking for Putin says a summit must take careful preparations in advance, what he means is, when are the Americans going to reach some set of terms on which the two presidents can have a discussion and an agreement. They're not going to have a summit meeting to abuse each other. They're not going to have a summit meeting with a hollow peace, which is of the type of so-called peacemaking that Trump has used in the past, from the Congo to Gaza, from Gaza to Cambodia and Thailand, from Thailand to Iran, and so on. These are hollow agreements. And Russia has made clear on this issue it wants to pursue the understandings, but waits for the US side to come to terms. And that's where we started today's broadcast. Those in our audience who want the news should understand that the anti-corruption campaign in Kiev is another way the US side is trying to achieve a set of terms on which the war can end, short of, that's saving the Zelensky regime from total destruction that it's facing as the military defenses in the east collapse from one city to the next. Have I answered your question? We are giving our audience the news, but the news is a bit complicated, a bit subtle, because it comes down to what's not happening. What's not happening is any form of agreement that the Trump administration's capable of to negotiate. And in that sense, the news here, folks, is Trump's beating a retreat. Trump is retreating from his notion that you can force, by US display of force, tariff force, military force, you can force your adversary, Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, Russia, Hamas. You can force your adversary to surrender. You can force them to the negotiating table to sign a peace on terms you want. This, let's call it the Trump strategy of extortion. Force triggers settlement on terms that Trump dictates. This scheme is failing everywhere. And the news is Trump's in retreat. He's not just giving up on tariffs on bananas and tomatoes in the US domestic market. Why is he doing that? Because the US voters continue to show that they think inflation is the weakest of Trump's demonstrations of policy. That's the polls show inflation, US voter worry about inflation, is destroying the public approval of Trump's presidency. So he's retreating from that, first on bananas and tomatoes, and the rest will come soon enough. In Venezuela, such a display of force never seen off a Caribbean state before, is now supplanted by Trump's indication. Mr. Maduro, he doesn't refer to the president of Venezuela as Mr. Maduro, but he says and admits Maduro wants to talk, and he's ready now for negotiations. That's a retreat. Trump is beating a retreat. Only 2 weeks ago, he basically called off the talks with Maduro by calling off his special envoy, the sort of Stephen Witkoff of the Mediterranean, that was Richard Grenell, calling off the talks with Venezuela. Now he's calling them on again. That means Trump's strategy is in retreat. And we can see that also in the Ukraine war. And that's the sign that we've been talking about in the anti-corruption campaign in Kiev. And we can go on to talk about that as the Americans have tried to enforce their peace in Gaza against the Israeli genocide and to try to increase pressure on Iran. All of these things are a retreat by Trump because he can't get his way by force, by peace by force, by war by obliteration. He's losing on each of these fronts, and so he's retreating.
Looking at the behavior of the Trump administration in the Red Sea, they came to power. They were talking about the Red Sea. We're going to defeat the Yemenis, Houthis. Then the
Yes.
war with Iran, and right now, as you mentioned, with Venezuela. Do you think that the war is in this Latin America, in the case of Venezuela, is not going to happen? If so, how is that going to help the Trump's position in negotiating with the, with the president of Venezuela? Because so far, what we've heard from him, he said that he's ready to talk with the United States. He's ready to sell oil to the United States. He's ready to everything, any sort of type. But
Yes.
it seems that after all, Rubio is not happy with that. Rubio doesn't want him in power in Venezuela.
You're right, and you're making a good point. You're basically saying there's factional difference that's so considerable inside the Trump administration. They speak with multiple tongues, and they do different things, contradicting each other. Yes, that's true. Rubio would be for invading Cuba and changing the regime in Cuba. President Trump has extended his so-called drugs war to, in his recent remarks, half admitting that fentanyl doesn't come out of Venezuela, but does come from Mexico, and cocaine and the drug flows into the United States, he said, create a problem for him with Mexico and Colombia. Now, you've had Ambassador Freeman spell out very lucidly what the real dynamics of this so-called drug war story is as a cover story for regime change in Mexico, regime change in Colombia, regime change in Ecuador, regime change in Venezuela, and so on. I can only invite everyone to revisit Ambassador Freeman's account of that. I can say that 50 years ago, believe it or not, 50 years seems a long time, I wrote a book, published a book in New York called Drugs and Minority Oppression, which is a history of US drug wars from the 1890s. Each time aimed at a minority ethnic group in the United States, each time picking a different drug, opium, the opiates, then marijuana, then heroin, and so on, right through until the Vietnam War, a history of drug wars, which, and I have to agree, in the book 50 years ago, as Freeman said the other day, by implementing these so-called drug wars, what do? You increase the profitability of smuggling. You don't affect the demand for drugs, not in the United States, not anywhere. Decriminalizing the drug trade is a more effective way of meeting the demand without creating the profitability of the drug trade. Wars against drugs have a almost 200-year history in the United States of benefiting the so-called drug cartels. As an enemy of the US that Trump and Rubio want to speak of at the moment. Drug cartels, narco-terrorists, these are the words now. They were differently used during the Nixon administration, and they were differently used in the 1890s in San Francisco against Chinese opium dens. The story's always the same. The underlying purpose of these wars is different politically, economically. The drug story is a camouflage. Now, having said all that, suppose we all agree and understand that, what exactly is deterring Trump, forcing his retreat, forcing Rubio to curb his tongue? Answer: effective defense. Venezuela is organizing effective popular defense effective military defense. It can be invaded, yes. It could be destroyed, yes. But the cost to the United States of such an invasion, such an attack, we've referred to here in reminding everyone of JFK's Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba as a Bay of Pigs risk. Trump is retreating from the Bay of Pigs risk in Venezuela. That's why he's talking. Why can he agree with Maduro on drugs? Because he just agreed with President Xi of China. China's agreed to, quotes, do more about controlling the export of so-called fentanyl precursor drugs so they can't be manufactured in the Americas and then re-exported. If China can come to that agreement, so can Maduro, just as you said. And Maduro could sweeten such a deal with mineral resource concessions and oil field concessions to the United States, as Trump wants to trump it, right? Whether that would mean the loss or transfer of Russian oil concessions, Chinese resource concessions in Venezuela, is something the press in the United States has been reporting, misreporting as information, disinformation as lies. However, the important thing is here, Trump is in retreat because Venezuela poses a defense threat that it would inflict on an invading US force more casualties than Trump could possibly survive politically at home with. That's the important thing. He can blast so-called narco-terrorist speedboats out of the sea, off the Venezuelan coast, off the Colombian coast, because they cause no casualties for the US. But it has no impact in the US on US voter support for Trump. So where do we end up here? The US is in retreat, and everyone across the world can see that. You asked, will there be war in Venezuela? Well, podcasts make their living, draw their audience, regrettably in a way. We both agree about that. And as our audience does, by headlining, World War III is coming. World War III is about to happen. It's not as gripping to say this war won't happen this week. That's not exactly the message that's entertaining, regrettably. But it's the truth. The truth here is that effective defense stops a war happening without the news of bloodshed, because there's no bloodshed. And that is an achievement not just of the Maduro government in Venezuela, it's an achievement of those who are backing Maduro and helping make that defense credible deterrent. And that's principally the Russian side. But it's not something one will find President Putin trumpeting, celebrating in the way Trump celebrates the use of force. The rest of the world, opposed to Trump, is simply more civilized. But Trump uses this rhetoric to cover his retreat when deterrence becomes more painful for him, and he loses what we've called in this program escalation dominance. His notion of escalation dominance is obliteration of, as we've talked about before, Iranian nuclear plants. When that fails to produce the peace he wanted a Nobel Peace Prize for, and deterrence becomes effective, he loses the escalation initiative. The escalation initiative, he understands, neither makes votes at home nor money for his family and associates. When he can't make money, when he risks votes, he stops and runs away. Trump running away is a headline that you haven't seen yet, folks, but it's happening.
Yeah. John, we had Donald Trump praising the UN Security Council for adopting his resolution to
Yes,
establish a so-called international force in Gaza.
yes,
And we and Russia and China voted to abstain.
yes.
And how did you find it? What's your take on that?
It's a complicated one. And some in our audience think that Russia and China should have done more. But this is the UN Security Council, and it's a body which is extremely limited in its capacity to influence the outcomes of the major conflicts we're talking about. Russia is almost alone in condemning the UN Security Council's Secretary General Guterres for bias, for taking sides against Russia in favor of the Ukraine war against Russia. None of the other states have attacked Guterres's credibility throughout the Ukraine war, as Russia has done. In this particular case, we could say that the UN Security Council's resolution 2803, 2803 of 2025 is a very difficult resolution to get the exact document for. In preparing for tonight's broadcast, I tried to get the actual text of resolution voted, and the UN Security Council websites won't give it to me. So if members of our audience can get the document, by all means, let's see it. But here's the story. The UN Security Council Resolution 2803 was a Trump initiative. Remember, the US ambassador to the UN now is Michael Waltz, who got booted out of the national security position in Washington after a faction fight there. Waltz came up with language that was to implement Trump's idea of the Gaza peace agreement. The peace agreement, which is capped by something we've identified as the BOP, the Board of Peace, BOP. And in Trump's celebration resolution, in which he thanks everybody, including Russia and China, without mentioning that they did not vote for this, the BOP is at the top. And Trump says he is at the top of the BOP. Top of the BOP. Top of the BOP is then to implement a military force and a transitional government replacing Hamas, demilitarizing the Palestinians in Gaza, and imposing on Palestine in Gaza, to start with, a combination military and civilian force supervised by Trump, and as the resolution says, in consultation with Israel and Egypt. So Israel and the United States have the final word, and Egypt gets to click its heels and salute, as Egypt has ever since the unlamented presidency of Anwar Sadat. This is a construction at UN Security Council in language the US drafted, pardon me, of Trump's 20-point peace plan for Gaza, celebrated at Sharm el-Sheikh. Russia resisted. China resisted this language. And over more than a week or 2 weeks, they attempted, in Russia in particular, the Representative Nebenzia insisted on putting clarity in the language. Who would oversee Israeli military withdrawal? Who would secure humanitarian supplies so that the starvation weapon the Israelis are using for genocide still would be how to say, replaced effectively and independently of the Israelis. The Russian side made it clear none of this is independent of Israel. None of it. It's all an implementation of Netanyahu and Trump's combination to enforce what they couldn't achieve by military means against Hamas. Hamas is opposed to the BOP. It's opposed to the military force. It's opposed to it. It has accepted a transition government of technocratic individuals, non-political individuals who are Palestinians, but does not agree that the decision on who they should be comes from Israel or even Egypt. As to who would fill the fourth, Trump's indicated he can squeeze the money out of Saudi Arabia and Qatar and squeeze the men out of Pakistan. Pakistan is one of the principal supporters of the BOP. Pakistan is proposing to provide them troops paid by the Saudis, commanded by the Israelis through the BOP in Gaza. This is all the language that has passed through the 2803 in the UN. But when Russia resisted, when China resisted, the Americans then offered some draft language. It's interesting from a, let's say, political point of view to see the way in which the language was changed over these last few weeks, but we don't have time for that. Let me come to the bottom line here. The bottom line was that Russia and China abstained because this, they said, and the Benzia's statement, there is a Russian statement. I'm looking down at my papers to find it. Comments by the permanent mission of the Russian Federation, the UN, on Russia's draft UNSC resolution on Gaza. Russia had its own draft, and the object of the draft was to pacify Trump on the one hand, support the so-called peace in Gaza on the one hand, and then prevent the BOP and the Israeli-directed transition government and military force of pursuing by their means what they couldn't achieve by military means. But the Russian draft was rejected. It wasn't just that Russia abstained. The Russian draft resolution was rejected by the Americans and their allies. So this is a story of word fighting in New York to parallel the military and genocidal conflict in Gaza. And it ends in the same way, with massive uncertainty, with Trump celebrating a hollow victory, Russia abstaining because that's all it can do in the UN. You can't fire anything but words at the UN. And in the UN Security Council, Russia fired its draft resolution, and that draft resolution was blocked by the Americans. So it's an example in, let's call it, diplomatic exchange of the war in Gaza that goes on today. And it's not got an outcome that's any more peacemaking, any more definitive as an end to Israeli genocide than what we've seen at the celebration at Sharm el-Sheikh, or the so-called peace agreement that Trump got Hamas to agree to in principle several weeks ago. It's a repeat by words of the same war.
John, it seems in this plan they have, they want to send by January 2026, they're going to send 20,000 soldiers, troops to Gaza. And they're coming from Azerbaijan, Egypt, Indonesia, Qatar, Turkey. I don't know if Turkey going to be in those, because Israel has rejected. Netanyahu said that Turkey cannot be part of this.
Yes.
Do you think that Turkey going to be part of it, or it seems that the document says that, but I don't know if Israel would accept that.
As I understand it today, this war of words in New York has not produced anything more than vague promises of troops from each of these countries. Azerbaijan's a relative newcomer. All of these, the list, starting with Azerbaijan, Indonesia, Pakistan, are countries that wish to pacify Trump immediately for the tariff trade reason, and second, for their particular bilateral conflicts underway. Azerbaijan's with Armenia, Iran, and other states, and we can go through the list. How to say it differently from what I've just said. There's no certainty and no agreement that such a force can be gathered. The Russian side has made it clear. What's their real role? Is their role to attack Hamas and demilitarize the Gaza Strip? Because if that's their role, it will fail in the same way as the Israelis have failed, by putting in nominally, religiously, Muslim soldiers from Azerbaijan, Pakistan, India, and potentially Turkey. Do you achieve any kind of outcome against the Palestinians, the fellow Muslims, that the Israeli Jews were unable to achieve? Do you, as it were, use religion as a weapon against the Palestinians? Muslim against Muslim. That's Trump's idea. It's going to fail. About Turkey, why is Israel so intent on blocking the Turks? Answer: because Israel is competing with Turkey, and we've had a program on this before, in Syria. Okay, in Syria, Syria has been partitioned into three: a Turkish zone along the traditional Ottoman Empire, Sancak, around Latakia, and along the Mediterranean coast down to the Lebanese border. The Israeli partition that's moving across the Golan Heights and towards the suburbs of Damascus. The American partition, which covers the east from the Jordan border and the US base at Al-Tanf up to the Iraqi border, and covering the oil fields and the Kurdish region. Israel is competing with Turkey for control of the regime just installed in Damascus. The acting president al-Jilani, al-Shara, his war name and his peace name, so to speak. So Israel will not encourage Turkey to have a military presence in Gaza. Now, that would be a real turn up for the books. It would revert to the Ottoman book of the empire, when Egypt and Gaza and Palestine were all part of Ottoman rule. Oh no, that's not the Jewish empire plan of Prime Minister Netanyahu, and it won't be tolerated by Trump, who doesn't understand any of this but can be quickly informed about what's not going to happen. So Turkish policy is, on the one hand, to gain traditional Ottoman positions territorially, militarily, economically, and they're doing that in Syria. Traditionally, that's a Turkish approach. And President Erdogan is traditional and Turkish imperial in the same way. On the other hand, he wishes to show Muslim solidarity with the Palestinians, and he makes all sorts of statements against Israel while continuing to supply oil and all sorts of other commodities which benefit Turkey and his own family in particular. So Turkish policy is two-faced and fork-tongued, and it won't result in any significant Turkish gain in Palestine or in Gaza. That's the Turkish position. But Turkey's a real state. Pakistan is a failed state economically. It's a weak state economically, but it's a powerful force militarily. It has nuclear weapons. It has lost its recent war, to rehash something we just said, with India. So it finds its way, and I recommend our audience reread the New York Times version of how Pakistan employed lobbyists to get to Trump and persuade Trump to adopt Pakistan as one of his favorite militaries, one of his favorite Muslim nation states. And Trump is implementing this scheme, which is also beneficial for him, his family, and others financially. So money comes with arms. Money comes before arms in the Trump administration's plan of action. But this is all pie in the sky, in the words adopted in resolution, in the resolution 2803 in the UN Security Council. So its practical meaning is, again, Trump's gaining in words but retreating with his legs. His head's going one way, his mouth, better to say, goes one way. His legs are running in the opposite direction. Why? In Gaza, because Hamas continues to pose a significant military deterrent threat. It hasn't won its war in that way. It has, however, won the battle for deterrent value. It can deter demilitarization imposed by the BOP, just as it's prevented Israel from occupying and expelling all the Palestinians. That's the terrible history of Palestinian resistance, each loss more grievous than the first, but they've resisted successfully. Iran, more successful.
Actually, the newly released Epstein emails from July 2018, John, show that Epstein, reacting to Imran Khan's election in Pakistan, he said that he's a much greater threat to peace than Erdogan, Khamenei, and the leader of Iran, Xi and Putin. And he sees that this is a bad news, and it shows how important Pakistan is for the whole case. The strategic, this strategy of the United States in that region when it comes to China, Russia, Iran, and the whole Middle East and the West Asia. Pakistan is so much important. Nobody paying that much attention to Pakistan.
Well, you and I know that, and thank you for saying it. We don't need the late unlamented Epstein to help us understand the significance of Pakistan as a kind of Muslim Ukraine war-fighting platform. This has been a terrible burden on the Pakistani people, because each war that the Pakistani army loses, it gains in political strength at home. So basically, Imran Khan represented an alternative to military rule in Pakistan. Let's not forget the hanging of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, the last powerful political civilian leader of Pakistan, whom the military overthrew and ultimately executed. Pakistan, we don't have time at this stage of our broadcast to go into Pakistani politics, and we welcome audience participation and disagreement on how to read Pakistani politics. But you made a very important point, Nima, and thank you for doing it. Pakistan is a major platform for future US strategy to fight Iran, to the west of Pakistan, to fight in Afghanistan, to the west, to India as a major challenge to European and American hegemony in the region. India needs to reestablish its corridor, its strategic connection territorially with Russia through Tajikistan, and that puts the future of the territory of Kashmir, currently under part Pakistani control, a base for the kind of JEM terrorism we've been talking about. That's the future for that territory must be understood to be a strategic question mark for the United States, for Pakistan, for India, for Russia, and for China. So this is a new cockpit of terrible war making. You've made that point, and let's emphasize it for everybody. To understand Pakistan and India are a cockpit for major strategic realignment in that part of the world. Trump thinks he can recruit Munir's henchmen and some of his troops to go beat up on Hamas in Gaza. It's an illusion, but Trump takes the illusion to the bank. The Pakistanis have been pouring millions of dollars into the Trump family and connections through what are known as legal lobbyists in Washington. And you can start by reading the legal lobbying framework Pakistan set up by looking at the New York Times report on Pakistan lobbying published last week. But lobbying's the front for bribery. Lobbying's the front for Trump's money making out of creating profit Trump towers out of each one of these war zones. This is the way he makes war. But, as we've said, when you can counter, resist, deter him in war, he runs away. And India has the capability to show him he'd better run away from Pakistan.
Exactly. Thank you so much, John. It was a great pleasure to talk to you today, and see you next week.
See you next week, Nima. Thank you very
Have a
much.
great time. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.